Welcome to our third Spotlight Series event of the year, Public Monuments in the Human Landscape. My name is Kristen Brogdon, and I'm the Director of Artistic and Community Programs for Northrop. For access purposes, I'll mention that I'm a blonde white woman with blue glasses, and today I'm wearing a black jacket and a black and purple dress. The University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership of the Institute for Advanced Study, the University Honors Program, and Northrop to present lectures, panel discussions, exhibits, and other events throughout the academic year around timely topics of interest. The six-part 2022-23 series focuses on how data, their collection, analysis, and the research questions that rely on them connect to the deeply personal lived experiences of individual human beings and to the human condition at large. Before we begin, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement that continues to be a work in progress as the university works together with the 11 tribal nations that share geography with the state now known as Minnesota. Northrop, the Institute for Advanced Study, and the University Honors Program respectfully acknowledge that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. The University of Minnesota is founded as a land-grant institution, and we recognize that our founding came at a dire cost to the Dakota people. The Dakota were forced to cede their lands in return for goods and services, but the government did not uphold the terms of these treaties, leading to widespread devastation. We recognize this painful past, and we honor Dakota people's history on this land, their sovereignty, and their continued contributions to our region. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters reflect the skies. The Dakota and numerous other indigenous peoples whose cultural, spiritual, and economic practices are intrinsically woven to this landscape hold this land sacred. We recognize them as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it who had thriving and vibrant communities prior to disruption by settlers. Today, the state of Minnesota shares geography with 11 tribal nations. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and hold the University of Minnesota accountable to recognize and counter the historical and contemporary injustices that continue to impact Indigenous people through mutually beneficial partnerships, research, policies, and practices that respect indigeneity. As we move through this year's Spotlight Series, I'm grateful for the knowledge and the research of the Native and Indigenous women who have participated in each of our panels this fall. They remind me that our relationships to land, that your relationship to the land wherever you are today, and all of these relations are vital parts of a full understanding of how we think about food security, mapping, and public art. Today's conversation in particular will delve into the ways we memorialize our histories within our human landscape, whose perspectives are centered, and why and when. And the boards you see behind me and behind the panelists remind me that the laws and decisions we've made about land in the Twin Cities continue to have impacts on marginalized and oppressed people. I share my gratitude for our guests today as they help us understand these relations in deeper ways. Before I introduce those guests, I want to offer a few technical instructions for our audience members. We do have a captioner working with us today. We recommend that online attendees view captions by clicking the stream text link shared via the chat. We'll be using Slido to facilitate our audience Q&A today. You can submit questions anytime during our program. Attendees can use their smartphones and either scan the QR code displayed on screen or go to www.slido.com and enter the code Spotlight Series. Please note that questions can be submitted anonymously and do have a 160-character limit. We encourage you to upvote previously submitted questions to ensure that we address questions based on audience interest. For those who have joined us in the Best Buy before, you might notice that our backdrop looks a little different today. We're honored today to have boards here on stage from Save the Boards. Save the Boards is a community-based preservation project focused on raising awareness about state-sanctioned violence and the power of protest art as a form of resistance and healing. Boards and murals collected following the murder of George Floyd are used to emphasize the importance of providing space in the community for reflection, learning, and creation. Thank you to Kenda and to the entire Save the Boards team for making their presence possible today. And now, without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce today's guests. Jean M. O'Brien, citizen White Earth Ojibwe Nation, is Distinguished McKnight University Professor and Northrop Professor of History at the University of Minnesota. She is a co-founder and past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association and inaugural co-editor with Robert Warrior of the association's journal, Native American, and Indigenous Studies. She has published 7 books, most recently Allotment Stories, Indigenous Land Relations Under Settler Siege. O'Brien is an elected member of the Society of American Historians and was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2022. Katrina Phillips is an associate professor of history with a focus on Native history and the history of the American West at Macalester. Born and raised in northern Wisconsin, Professor Phillips is a proud citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. She is the author of Staging Indigeneity, Salvage Tourism, and Performances of Native American History. As a public historian, Phillips's work has appeared in the Made by History section of the Washington Post. She's appeared on Native America Calling, NPR's 1A, and Indigeneity Rising. She's also the author of several children's books, including the recent Super Sheroes of History, Indigenous Peoples, Women Who Made a Difference. Finally, our third participant and moderator of today's conversation is Robyne Robinson. Robyne has had a commanding presence in the Minnesota arts community as an entrepreneur, advocate, journalist, designer, and consultant. Robinson created an Emmy-winning platform for Minnesota arts during her years as a TV news anchor reporter at Fox 9 News. Robinson has served on numerous arts boards, including the Walker Art Center, Minneapolis College of Art and Design, MCAD, and the Minnesota Museum of American Art, where she served as board chair. Thank you all, and Robyne, take it away. Actually, we're going to start today with Jean O'Brien's present, or sorry, I am gonna, the third try is always the charm. Katrina Phillips, welcome to the podium.
Uju Nijiwag, Bungi Tagon Ninata Nishanabem, Edash Ninga Nishanabe Gagiged Ajana, Nimanwenda Miyawa Namanungum. Ganujo Gimakwe, Indigenous Kaz and Nishanabe Mung, Edash Katrina Phillips, Indigenous Kaz Jaganashi Mung. Makwan and Duadam, Minawam is Kwabikang, Namindage Beat Gaz. So I said, hello, my friends. I only speak a little Ojibwe, but I will speak Ojibwe for a little while. I'm glad to be here today. Tall Chief Woman is what I am known as in Ojibwe, and Katrina Phillips is my English name. I am from the Bear Clan, and I am enrolled at Red Cliff. I want to thank Kristen for asking me to be here today, and thank you to the folks in the Institute for Advanced Study and the Honors Program for joining with Northrop for this series. I also want to say thank you to everyone who's worked or is working behind the scenes to make this possible, including Abby, Carolina, Skylar, the folks in the tech booth, the folks who are doing all of the things that we can't see, but are necessary in order for us to do this today. And so last of all, thanks to all of you for joining us, whether you're in person or whether you're joining us online. And so our conversation today centers public monuments in the human landscape and the practice of erecting monuments tied to particular people, places, or events is seemingly ubiquitous. As my colleague, Dr. O'Brien, noted in our preparatory meeting, we often tend to walk past monuments without even knowing that they're there. But in the last few years, there's been a tide of reckoning in regards to the monuments that fill our public spaces. That's not to say, of course, that this is a new phenomenon. Contestations over the power of memory and the myriad meanings behind these monuments have been happening for decades. What appears to be a surging tide against monuments and memorials is really the culmination of a number of movements, both nationally and internationally. And it's important to note that few of these struggles are new struggles. They've been garnering more attention now due to the proliferation of media and new forms of technology and communication, but their historical undergirding is really powerful and has its own lengthy history that's worth noting. And this includes, among others, of course, right? I only have like 10 minutes here, and you're welcome that it's only 10 minutes. The Roads Must Fall campaign that started in South Africa in 2015. As you can see here, oh, sorry, could we go back one? Thank you. There's also the fact that protesters pushed an 1895 statue of slave trader Edward Colston into the River Avon in early June of 2020. And now this is a statue that had long been the source of controversy, due in large part to the fact that he made most of his fortune as part of the Royal African Company. The company had a monopoly on the West African slave trade and was known to brand the people it enslaved, a number estimated at somewhere between 85,000 to 100,000, with its RAC initials on their chests. The local council fished the statue out of the harbor a few days later, and it was put on display a year later, as shown here, as part of a temporary museum exhibit. And so the next photo shows something that happened closer to home, when members and supporters of the American Indian movement pulled down Columbus in St. Paul, Minnesota. And of course, this was not the only statue of Columbus that came down in 2020 or 2021. The next slide shows the well-documented reimaginings of the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond. The subsequent slide shows the statue of Juan de Oñate in New Mexico. And this is several decades after someone had chopped off the statue's foot, as you can see in the photo up here on the right. And so the historical foundation for this is that Juan de Oñate is most well known for ordering the brutal 1599 massacre at Acoma Pueblo. And this is a few years, so the statue's foot was chopped off, and then a few years later, someone painted his remaining foot red and wrote, "Remember 1680, the year of the Pueblo Revolt," on the base. And so historian Kirk Savage contends that while monuments are often built to commemorate specific battles, the monuments themselves often become visible signs of battles between what John Barnes calls dueling memories and interpretations. And so I was lucky enough to serve on the advisory board for the National Monument Audit, which was produced by an organization called Monument Lab in partnership with the Mellon Foundation. And so as the next slide shows, the team at Monument Lab spent a year looking at close to 500,000 records of historic properties that are created and maintained by federal, state, local, tribal, institutional, and publicly assembled sources. And so from that 500,000, they narrowed it down to a study set of about 50,000 conventional monuments, representing data collected from every US state and territory. And so as Monument Lab contends, the National Monument Audit allows us to better understand the dynamics and trends that have shaped our monument landscape, to pose questions about common knowledge about monuments, and to debunk falsehoods and misrepresentations and misperceptions within public history. The National Monument Audit is meant to inform Mellon's Landmark Monuments Project, which is a $250 million investment that's designed to transform the way our country's histories are told in public spaces and ensure that future generations inherit a commemorative landscape that venerates and reflects the vast, rich complexity of the American story. On the next slide here, I have the 4 key findings from the report. 1, that monuments have always changed. 2, that the monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. The 3rd finding, that the most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. And lastly, that the story of the United States as told by our current monuments misrepresents our history. And so I did the research so you don't have to. And so with the next slide here, as you can see, these are some of the key findings from the audit. There are likely few surprises in the top 10. We've got Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Christopher Columbus, MLK, St. Francis of Assisi, Robert E. Lee, Casimir Pulaski, who actually, this is one figure I needed to look up because I was really, I was like, the first ones, I'm good, I got it. This one, not so much. But Pulaski actually came from Poland to fight in the US Revolution after meeting Benjamin Franklin in France, and is actually known as the father of the American cavalry. And so once I saw that, I went, okay, cool, now I got it, I'm covered. And then rounding out the top 10, we have Benjamin Franklin, JFK, and Thomas Jefferson. The first woman on the list is Joan of Arc, who comes in at 18th place with 27 monuments. Harriet Tubman is the first Black woman on the list at 24th, and she is actually tied with Tecumseh, who is the first Native man on the list, with 21 monuments. Sacagawea, the first Native woman, on the list is 28th, tied ironically enough with Alexander Hamilton and Junipero Serra with 20 monuments each. And many of the figures in the top 50 are military and political figures, and there are a decent number of explorers as well. And so in all honesty, I pulled some of the more prominent names out of the rest of the top 50, including Ulysses S. Grant, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, and Anthony Wayne, as well as William Clark, Jacques Marquette, Meriwether Lewis, Sam Houston, and Daniel Boone. The data, of course, is a critical component of the audit, and it's really fascinating to see numbers, right? And again, with the side note that this is based on available sources and records. But context is also important. And we need to think about when, where, and why these monuments went up in the first place and who put them there. Because monuments and memorials tell us more about the time period in which they were constructed than they do about the era they supposedly represent. Most Confederate statues, for instance, went up in the Jim Crow era, not the decades immediately following the Civil War. And so as a scholar of Native history, I'd like to use my last few minutes to use Sacagawea as an example. In 1902, Eva Emery Dye published a book called The Conquest, The True Story of Lewis and Clark, painting Sacagawea as the heroine who guides the Lewis and Clark expedition to success. Sacagawea becomes, as Rebecca Yeager notes, a symbol for Indian acceptance. Now, for those of you keeping score, this is happening nearly a century after the Corps of Discovery trespassed on Native lands. But this happens during the Progressive Era because upper middle class white women are doing more public work and taking on bigger roles with suffrage and similar causes. And so the last slide I have here demonstrates that this is the moment where we start to see the creation of statues, monuments, memorials, plaques, all kinds of historical landmarks dedicated to Sacagawea. The first one, as shown up here on the left, is a bronze monument unveiled at the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in Portland, Oregon. The statue was designed by Alice Cooper, not the musician. This Alice, it's a very small joke, but I have to make it every time. And so this Alice Cooper was born in Iowa in 1875 and went to the Art Institute of Chicago. So hopefully the only parallels we can see are the name. And the National American Women's Suffrage Association raised the funds to build the statue. The statue depicts her looking west with her child on her back. The plaque that accompanies it reads, quote, "Erected by the women of the United States in memory of the only woman in the Lewis and Clark expedition and in honor of the pioneer mother of Oregon," end quote. And so this is not the only statue of Sacagawea, and it's not the only statue that uses a particular image of a Native person in order to construct a particular narrative. But the ways in which her name, her image, and her journey are deliberately co-opted and manipulated to fit a particular narrative are crucial to understanding the contemporary conversations around these monuments. And so the second monument that you see here, this one was unveiled at the Sacagawea Interpretive, Cultural, and Education Center in Salmon, Idaho in 2005. It's part of a 71-acre park that's dedicated to Sacagawea, and this is a town that's about 150 miles west of Butte, Montana. And so I haven't been able to find a lot of information around the dedication of this more recent monument, but it's fascinating to see how this narrative, like many others enshrined in monument form, has maintained such a hold on the collective American imagination. And so in closing, I would just like to say that we can and we should draw connections to other kinds of monuments, names of buildings, names of streets, and so on. We should be thinking about who's remembered, and we should be thinking about when, where, and how they're remembered. What kind of effect does this have on underrepresented or historically excluded communities? And how can we see this as part of a broader conversation around dismantling and undoing what's led to the oppressive or unjust structures they represent? And one of the questions I think we've all gotten in regards to monuments is, of course, what now? What comes next? How can our communities move forward to create public spaces that are more inclusive? Who matters in this public space? What do we do with these statues when there are multiple stakeholders, people for whom these statues hold significant meaning? At the same time, however, we would be remiss if these are the only opinions we take into account. We also need to think about what it feels like to go around in an environment where we see these monuments telling us that we don't belong. And so with that, I will say miigwech bizindawiag nungum. Thank you for listening to me today, and I will turn it over to my colleagues.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking Katie for thanking everybody here for making this event possible and for all of you for being here. And then I just have to point out that I'm in the maybe unenviable position of following somebody who had a career as a performer before becoming a historian and before an on-air television journalist. So wish me luck. So I want to talk today a bit about my book written with Lisa Blee called Monumental Mobility, the Memory Work of Massasoit. We take as our case study the statue of Massasoit by sculptor Cyrus Dallin. It was installed in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1921 to commemorate the tercentenary of the landing of the Pilgrims. Dallin's statue is intended to memorialize the Pokanoket Massasoit, which means leader in Wampanoag, as a welcoming diplomat who negotiated the first treaty with the English. But this book reverberates in our contemporary moment, we hope, with monuments of all sorts being toppled in the months and years surrounding the global protests over racism and capitalism connected to the murder of George Floyd right here in Minneapolis, some of which are depicted here, including the St. Paul monument in the middle. The Massasoit, again, the Wampanoag word for leader, was a participant in the mythical First Thanksgiving that stands at the center of American national origin stories, in which we're about to commemorate soon. So here's an image of that first Thanksgiving on the left, mythical, again, mythical, and on the right, a historical photo of the monument. In our book, we track the physical and narrative mobility of the Massasoit story through its inception and its movement in the guise of several unauthorized reproductions in numerous US locations through nefarious dealings in the fine art market to illuminate how the statue's attachment to national origins did and did not move with the statues. Taking as our point of departure the replication of an original statue with the status of fine art, our book examines its mobility from multiple angles. It analyzes the original inspiration for the monument, its design, installation in various locations, dedication ceremonies in diverse places over time, how to understand its receptions by audiences, including Indigenous audiences, how it has and does figure in tourism, and importantly, how Indigenous public intellectuals have intervened in historical narratives around settler colonialism read through the Massasoit statue. What we found was that the meaning of the statue, along with the story of colonization and the founding of the nation it was commissioned to invoke, continues to evolve in Massachusetts and wherever the copy is wound up. The force behind these changed meanings are twofold. Through the work of Indigenous intellectuals and the ways in which public history can reconfigure our relationship to the present through engagement with the past. The historical meaning surrounding the Massasoit suggests the rich potential of Indigenous public historians to intervene and sanitize national narratives of origins. Can the statue prompt viewers to reckon with the structural violence of settler colonialism in commemorative landscapes? Or does it further entrench celebratory narratives of national origins? Our book is connected to that volatile debate, suggesting that monuments to settler colonialism ought to be part of the conversation about the place and meanings of historical monuments in general. A tourist to Plymouth today can easily access this pilgrim-centered story, as we did on our research trips in a richly curated memorial landscape, by gazing upon a diminutive rock we are instructed to venerate, taking a tour with a pilgrim-clad guide who insists the Pawtuxets gave away their land because they no longer wanted it. Not true. By listening to a visiting center volunteer explain that all the native residents had died off. We actually heard someone say that. and by perusing the town's gift shop stuffed with depictions of happy pilgrims and Indians sharing a feast. The memorial landscape and dominant narratives of its history insist on maintaining a cognitive distance from the past that insulates visitors from uncomfortable truths, even as they purport to bring viewers closer to history by connecting them to hallowed ground. But Indigenous interventions in New England public history have made steady inroads since the historic Day of Mourning protests in 1970 as a counter-narrative to the American Thanksgiving rituals that came to be an annual event. These ongoing, next slide, please. These ongoing protests demonstrate the dynamic engagement with memorialization. So this is from 2018. In the mid-1990s, a new plaque was installed next to the Massasoit Monument that offers an indigenous counter-narrative to the sanitized national origin story. The original installation was meant to set in bronze and stone that insists on a reckoning with settler colonialism, indigenous dispossession, and genocide. If our interviews with passersby the Massasoit statue in Plymouth are any indication, local residents and tourists alike have taken note of the plaque, and many have reflected on the alternative narrative of Thanksgiving and the settler colonialism it explains. It was evidence in stone and metal that colonists did not simply disembark in a wilderness, that indigenous people did not give away their land and then dutifully die off. For those paying attention to the plaque, the story of peaceful colonization stopped making sense. Ever since its installation, visitors moved by the plaque's words have taken this more complicated narrative home with them. The annual Day of Mourning protests and the plaque beside the statue change interpretations of Massasoit and disrupt ritualized Thanksgiving mythology in Plymouth. These upended pilgrim-centered myths have reverberated in the historic district of Plymouth and surrounding area, including in connection with one of the town's storied historical institutions, Plymouth Plantation, renamed in the wake of the 2020 protests to Plymouth Pawtuxet. This slide shows the Wampanoag Indigenous program at Plymouth Plantation that became institutionalized in the wake of the original Day of Mourning protests. This living history venue and other New England public history sites and lots of other things take up the work of Indigenous public intellectuals since the rupture of the inaugural Day of Mourning protests. So that's a different timeline, right? Not 1620, but 1970. With the ramp up of the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's contact with Pawtuxet in 2021, Wampanoag and other Indigenous public intellectuals brought new energy to their engagement with this landscape to craft a more complicated and coherent depiction of New England's past. Tourists can now join Tim Turner on his native Plymouth tours, where Pawtuxet becomes visible and the crowded memorial landscape on the waterfront can be reevaluated from an Indigenous perspective. Next slide. Here you see him showing Indigenous landmarks on the landscape, the original paths that they used in the 17th century and places of significance to Indigenous people, not the statue. That's the place to start. Next slide. Mashpee Wampanoag, Paula Peters led a Wampanoag team of designers, researchers, and interpreters in creating a traveling exhibit titled Our Story, 400 Years of Wampanoag History, which non-Indigenous organizers of the 400th anniversary reluctantly made room for. Her team produced and toured exhibit panels aimed at non-Indigenous audiences starting in 2014. The first, titled Captured 1614, presents the Wampanoag perspective on the slaving expedition of Englishman Thomas Hunt, who seized 27 men and boys from Pawtuxet and Nauset. Peters explained in a press release, "This is a critical piece of the history of Plymouth that can't be told accurately without a Wampanoag perspective." Another slide. A brief local connection, 2017. Here's an image of the Walker Arts Center Sculpture Garden and the Sam Durant installation Scaffold. Many might remember the enormous controversy that erupted, led by Dakota protesters over the installation. I would note the irony that in interviews about the controversy, Durant revealed that he was born in Plymouth and that he remembered going to the Day of Mourning protests that somehow didn't prompt him to consider what he was doing with this installation. He only reflected on it in retrospect. I would also point out that this is a local example that shows the vital importance of engagement in the entire process of memorialization. whose voices are centered and whose voices are heard matters deeply. McKnight.
Kristen, I want to thank you for inviting me to take part in this really important discussion, and very important to me right now because of the transition that I have been making and evolution in my career through the arts. Full disclosure, I am also an advisory board member here at the Northrop Auditorium. So this issue has come up and it's been fully discussed, and is really one that's very important to me. Just some housekeeping. For my pronouns are she and her, and for visual assistance, there are 3 very tall women on this stage. All of us are very tall and long, and so I'm really thrilled because that often doesn't happen to be along with other very tall women. The voice also might be very familiar for those of you who are listening. And so, yes, it was 20 years of covering the news, but also arts and entertainment in the Twin Cities. And so I've always been very passionate about the Twin Cities, and in moving into the public art arena from the covering public art at the airport and then to doing my own consulting, it's made me very aware of how Minnesota is perceived in the arts world, and also Minneapolis. It is a very progressive city when it comes to the arts, and the state itself, it has a huge reputation in terms of the billions of dollars, almost $3 billion that the arts generate in the state of Minnesota. And Minneapolis is known that it's always been ahead of the curve when it comes to the arts. But as you know, in 2017, 3 full years before the newscasts were filled with the sight of crowds toppling statues after the death of George Floyd and the movement of social justice around the world, Minneapolis was the site of the movement to confront and remove any art monuments and public settings that demeaned or distorted the history of Native people. Now, if you've lived in Minnesota long enough, you know that bad news is always whispered, as if news can be contagious. So I'm sure we have all heard about the scaffold. The resulting protests and destruction of the gallows created by Sam Duran highlighted the long festering issues about public art and monuments, the lack of cultural understanding and representation in arts administration, the lack of community engagement, the lack of empowerment, the lack of a voice in the selection of public monuments and arts, the placement of commissioned art in public settings, and the sociological damage and message of supremacy in multicultural communities. So there's no surprise that the call for social justice following George Floyd's death led to the demand to dismantle dozens of public monuments across the country. But the rush to take them down, or in some cases knock them down, have only complicated an already complicated issue in public art. For example, New Mexico activists knocked down the Soldiers Memorial on the Santa Fe Plaza because of one of the 4 panels on the monument honors soldiers as heroes who died fighting, quote, savages. Native people have asked for those words to be removed from that monument since 1973. While they see the obelisk as a celebration of oppression and genocide, others, like veterans, consider it the commemoration of the ultimate sacrifice to preserve the country and to fight the expansion of slavery. After 2 years of community discussions, there have been 52 recommendations on what to do about the monument. Surveys show 33% of the residents in the community want it removed, 32% want it rebuilt, and no one thinks any consensus will be reached. The sculpture has been left in the hands of the city's public art department to look after. And for now, it's just left sitting on the plaza covered by a box until a decision is made on what to do with it. And the city of Santa Fe resolves its lawsuits from the numerous arrests that were made during the obelisk protest. In fact, many statues in public art collections deemed offensive sit in makeshift public art graveyards, decommissioned, and considered toxic. So our discussion today is to look at the issue of public monuments and discuss how do we find solutions for these inherited art tropes to prepare the way for new public art monuments that give the whole community an opportunity to tell a well-rounded, inclusive history, and also protect the artist and their vision. There also have to be new protections for the work, as well as for the artists who are today becoming agents of communication and history, agents of communication and messaging for communities when traditional methods of information and history sharing are aging, being replaced by narrow streaming electronic media, and silenced by force, legislation, and vigilantism. What do we do to protect the monuments and reframe their narrative without becoming the thing that we're fighting against? George Orwell thought he was writing science fiction in 1949 when he wrote, "Every statue and street has been renamed, every date has been altered, and the process is being continued day by day, minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right." He called it, doesn't mean he has to be right. We can change the narrative. And so let's talk about it. Okay, so we're here now. Okay. One of the things we did talk about, is we're here now in the moment. What do we do? And I think being in the public art arena, there is a paralyzing element to it because no one wants to be. It's on. It's on. It's on. Hello. Leave it on. Yep, I did. You guys hear me? There we go. So one of the things you did say is that we are now at this point that we have to figure out where we move next. And as a public art administrator, I find oftentimes this is where everybody is paralyzed. They don't know where to go after this. We've had numerous meetings. We have had numerous public hearings. You get one side that sees the importance of having the statues there. The other side says that we have to tear it down. What steps do we need to take to move forward so that there aren't these graveyards or boxes that sit around a piece until somebody figures out what to do? I think in Baltimore, there is a statue to Italian Americans. Another big green, red, and white flag has been painted around a box. The city of Baltimore has several statues that they decided they would loan out for an art exhibit in Los Angeles. When asked, what are you going to do with it when the exhibit comes down, they said, we have no idea. So what do we do to stop these crippling moments where people don't know what to do? We box them up or we just put them in graveyards?
Well, you're not pulling any punches here. We're going right for the big question right out of the gate. I think one of the things that for me, and like, I mean, Jeannie and I are historians, right? But I think one of the things for me, and this really was evident when the Columbus statue came down in St. Paul, and it's taking a look, and in this instance, right, it's why is there a statue of Columbus in St. Paul? And the reason there's a statue of Columbus in St. Paul is because of the xenophobia that Italian Americans faced in the United States. That's why we have Columbus Day in the first place, is because of the racism that targeted Italian Americans. And so by seeing these statues go up and the funds that were raised, right? Because it's not cheap, as far as I'm aware of, to like commission a statue, to have it made, the materials, labor, everything like that. But at the same time, it's finding a way to keep that history, to keep that context, while also recognizing that the statue itself is now a source, not just now, right? Has been for a long time a source of harm. And I think with a lot of these monuments that we're talking about here, I mean, there are ones at, out west with like the Bear River Massacre, right? Which happened in 1863. And you have these monuments, these plaques that are celebrating the massacre of Native people. And in instances like this, when you have something that causes so much harm to a community, I find it really hard to justify leaving it up. And again, and that still doesn't answer the question, and I'm well aware of that, but it's recognizing, right? What happens if it gets melted down? What happens if it's put somewhere and we let nature kind of literally take its course, right? But at the same time, right, it is that paralyzing question of what do we do now, right? And I mean, if I knew the answer, I'd probably I'd probably have a whole lot more money than I do, because people would be paying me to figure that out. But it is such a tricky question because of these multifaceted histories that we're dealing with. So
I think it is a really, really gnarly question. We don't have an answer, I don't think, at this point in time. In some ways, it just seems to me that in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, all of these questions exploded in a new way and all simultaneously and literally got global attention. And so, I mean, what that does is really, it shows that the question of what we're commemorating is connected to long histories of colonialism and racism that are not going to be fixed in a simple way, right? And so I'm comfortable with there not being an answer right away, because these situations were created over a long period of time. I mean, there are some routes to solutions. For example, I mean, with the Massasoit Monument, it's not the same as a manufactured monument to Jim Crow in that era and racism at all. It's a piece of fine art.
Exactly.
And, by a very famous at the time artist. And in fact, Indigenous folks in New England aren't arguing to take that thing down. Instead, they wanted their own marker. And so in some places, counter narratives are effective. There's a project, for example, of a Cherokee artist who's marking the Cherokee Trail of Tears with Indigenous perspectives on every marker that's there. So, I mean, that's just one approach. There's the graveyard approach. Yank down all the statues to whatever it is and put them in one place. That can be a powerful way of thinking about remembering as well, because it's marking, what were these things there for in the first place, and why are they now in a warehouse? Let's have a conversation about that. So I don't think there is an easy answer, or there's probably not an answer that's not individual to situations. And I do think that dialogue, exchange, engagement, conversations, even if they have to take a long time, is somewhere near what has to happen, I think. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's a tricky situation because, as you mentioned, the statue out east is considered fine art. And so now you have the conversation about the Visual Artists' Rights Act. Can you take it down? Because it has to be seen by not only the artist, maybe the artist's family is involved. Whatever was agreed to display it along with a museum, because I'm sure it has museum backing as well. So you have multiple layers that prevent it from being taken down, while in the meantime, you've got a community that's ready to yank it down or throw Fruit Loops on it, as we've seen from recent protests. That I think there was also tomato soup that was thrown on a Van Gogh recently. So it becomes dangerous the longer that you leave it up. But when you've got multiple layers like fine art, it becomes a very different story. But my question, also piggybacking on that, should you be turning some of these statues into fine art, which is what Baltimore did by loaning out their artwork for a Los Angeles exhibition? Are those the right decisions to make, or should it be taken out of public view until the context can be done properly and discussed amongst administrators? And I think the administration part is also an important issue, because you don't have people of color that are from the community or have a historical knowledge that will be able to tell you that the multiple ideas that you come up with won't work.
Although, you know, it's interesting because the Columbus statue in St. Paul sitting in a warehouse somewhere, right? And there's a commission. I can't remember what it's called. There's a commission that is examining and going to make a recommendation on what should be done with it. Right. But that was protected too, and it still got yanked down.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Columbus, Ohio, of all places, took down their Columbus statue. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
They're having a royal conversation there. Right. So, I mean, there are these property rights, there are all these layers of administration that affect things. But that, you know, you push people far enough, that's not enough to prevent the dialogue from getting real. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But my constant worry is that there's a timeline on all of this, because let's just be honest, there is a limit that people of color see, that white guilt only lasts so long. And so the conversation becomes much harder. What happens when people no longer want to listen? And that's the critical part of all of this, listening to people's stories so they can fully understand what triggers responses like this, what triggers the anger. What do we do when the clock runs out on these issues? Because people don't want to hear the complaints. I mean, 1973, you know, people from the American Indian movement have been fighting this a long time. And if many of you are, I see many gray hairs out here, you remember Vernon and Clyde Bellacourt and how long they have been fighting. So when does the clock run out on this? And why does it have to take so long?
I want to hear what Katie has to say, but I do want to just chime in with this one observation on that point for now. Historically, and let's date it to, you know, the civil rights movement and the Black freedom movement. Precipitated conversations about diversity, led to the creation of departments of American Indian Studies, African American Studies, kind of Latinx Studies, and so forth. And that was really only by force did that happen, but it happened. And lots of really important programs, like including our first in the United States Department of American Indian Studies here at the University of Minnesota, got established, and we are still here. But I'll tell you what, we've gone through some real ups and downs because people's attention does fade. It does go away. So for sure, we're in this moment of diversity, equity, inclusion work. It's not going to last, I don't think, as someone with gray hairs too, right? I've seen it too many times. I don't know what we do to really institutionalize it, but I will say this moment does feel different to me. This feels just much bigger than what we've seen before.
And yeah, I think, you know, to that point, it is really that a lot of these ideas have an expiration date, right? And a lot of it is, I'm trying to choose my words very carefully. But it's one of those things where it's the activism and the advocacy work from people within these communities that have continued to make their voices heard, whether or not people want to listen. And I say that as someone, so all of these movements predate me, right?
Right.
Like American Indian movement, like all of those things predate me.
Right.
And as a historian and as a scholar and as a Native woman, I can still see resonances of the work of those who came before us. It looks a lot different now.
Yeah.
But in so many of these instances, the work we see happening today is happening because of the work of those who came before us. And so it's always been there. Sometimes it's not quite as overt or explicit, but, and one of the examples I have, and it's a little bit tangential, but right after, the first couple nights of the George Floyd protests, you saw all of these photos of very visibly Native people at these protests. And thinking about the historical connections, not only within these individual communities, but also with these communities together.
Mhm.
Right? The fact that, the American Indian Cultural Corridor, it's not that far from 38th and Chicago.
Exactly.
And so that work looks different, but it's still happening today. And I think, like Jeannie said, I still have enough of the optimism, right? I'm not quite super jaded yet. I'm getting there. But it does feel different, right? That moment of, and it's a longer moment now too, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you think about how quickly news cycles turn over, how quickly
Exactly.
by this point, right? The fact that we're still able to have this conversation almost 3 years later is still really telling. We don't have a ton of answers. We don't have a lot of tangible, I don't want to say we don't have tangible results, right? But it's it's building the infrastructure, and those things take time. As hard as it is, those things take so much time,
Right.
and it's finding the motivation and the
Right.
strength to keep building on the work of those who came before us, and also in order to keep building it for those who are going to follow us.
If I can just add a couple things.
Yeah.
Katie wrote a wonderful Made by History piece in the Washington Post in the immediate, at the moment of the uprisings, in the connecting the American Indian movement and Black Lives Matters, all these movements together. And just to point out, the American Indian movement, very importantly, came out of the problem of police brutality in our communities.
Mhm.
So that's one thing. And so there's a trajectory there that's consistent. And also, just because we become less visible in the interregnums, all that work is still happening in the communities.
I'm going to pull out a few of these questions that are coming in. Thank you very much, everybody, for being so patient. But there's one here that says, can you speak more about how monuments and the groups that arrange for their creation shape public memory and our perceptions of history? I'm going to direct that to you, Katie.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Holy smokes. I think it's because monuments are so visible, right? It's not like you're commissioning a play, right? Or something that's ephemeral, that changes, that's different, that disappears. I think monuments are so kind of integral, right, to that, even though, like I said at the beginning, it seems like you walk by monuments every day and you don't even realize it. One example, I brought this up in our earlier conversation and then went and did more research. But there is now, as of 2019, there's a statue of Teddy Roosevelt outside of the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas. And so chronologically, that doesn't make any sense at all. Correct?
Right.
And even geographically, it doesn't make sense at all. And the statue, it's this enormous statue of, I'm talking like Rough Rider Teddy, right? Like on the horse, like all that stuff. And I was just in San Antonio a couple weeks ago and saw the statue for the first time. And I'm there with a friend of mine. And we're, as two scholars, we're sitting there like trying to put these pieces together. And so I went back and I did some more research. And in 2019, this folks in San Antonio came together, and it's part of this like Alamo Trail that connects, it's like 12 or 14 statues that connects the Briscoe Museum, which is this huge like sculpture kind of gallery museum in San Antonio, to the Alamo. But like, as I'm sitting there outside the Alamo eating tacos, because what else am I going to do in San Antonio? And just watching the number of people walk past the statue of Teddy Roosevelt and not even think about
I
it.
see it, yeah.
But what does it mean to walk by the statue of Teddy Roosevelt, to stop and see a deliberately imposing statue of Teddy Roosevelt outside the Alamo? And even the Alamo itself as a monument, right? It deliberately changes a particular narrative.
Yeah.
And makes it deliberately visible.
Mhm, mhm.
And I would just like, in terms of fundraising for these statues, it's all, of course, a very complicated thing, but most of those monuments to Jim Crow were fundraising was done by the Daughters of the Confederacy.
Exactly.
I mean, they were at it all over the country doing that. The Massasoit Monument was actually the project of the Improved Order of Red Men, which is a fraternal organization that's still around.
Wow.
And, you know, they were playing Indian. That was that still is a little bit their thing. And so this is like an iconic person that they connect all of their identity to American origins in this place. So they do fundraising all over the country in all kinds of complicated ways that we talk about. But, you know, people take a cause up and then you got to raise the money. You've got to figure out where you're going to put it. If you're going to put something on the National Mall, that's something else. That really takes something. But anytime you put up a monument, it takes campaigns of fundraising, design, where are you going to put it, who's going to take care of it, all of those kinds of things. So, I mean, it's not a casual thing.
This is a good question. Thank you, Susanna. It's for you, Jeannie, and follow up on it. How difficult was it to get the updated plaque in Plymouth installed? And was there any local pushback?
Oh, that is such a fascinating story. So that plaque actually went up in 1994 or 95, one of those. And it came about because in the previous years, or maybe it was two, I haven't read my book recently. There was it gets described as a melee. There was a kind of scuffle of some sort that happened at the Day of Mourning protests, and it got really out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
And in retrospect, the town of Plymouth, we had conversations with the United American Indians of New England, this group that's been around since 1970. And they said, you've got to do something about this plaque. And after lots and lots of negotiation, they agreed to install not just this plaque, but another one up the hill that I can talk about if you want me to. But and a bunch of other things, money for programming to bring Indigenous history into the schools. So lots and lots of things that happened. But what they extracted was the ability to write that plaque using whatever evidence they decided was important to them. In other words, they had to fight, but they managed to wrest control of the narrative from the historical societies that the town wanted them to use. And they said, no, this gets to be our narrative. So it was a moment, right?
Yeah.
They made them sit up and take notice. Hey, we're still here.
Yeah.
And you're erasing us and you're erasing our history, and we demand the right to tell it. So born in struggle.
I've got a really good question here. While people decide, and this is for either of you, while people decide to do what to do with monuments, would it help to have the collaboration of historians discussing the truth and perspectives and presenting that?
Yes.
Thank you. Very simple. Yeah. Anybody want to expand on that?
Of course, that was a glib answer.
Yeah.
Yes. But, really to spur conversation, right? Because an historian is going to bring an angle or angles, but they're not necessarily going to have all the perspectives of the people who engage with that monument or care about that history. Right? We strive for that, but that's hard. So, yeah, I mean, as a point of departure for a dialogue, I would say that makes sense.
Well, and I'm glad you just said yes, because I was like, yes. And again, like Jeannie said, we don't have all of the answers,
right?
But we have some. And and I know I keep saying context, right? But it's like, it's so important and helpful to know when a statue went up, who is funding it, right? And you know, to Jeannie's point about the improved order of red men, which is still a thing. They still have a website.
Mhm. A library we used. It's
Well,
in Waco, Texas.
well, and isn't there a sister organization like the Degree of Pocahontas?
Pocahontas, yes.
And so that tells you everything you need to know. But it's like having that information and having people who are not only good at research, but who like to do research, right? As parts of these conversations to help provide that fuller picture in order to be like, here's the information. This is a statue that was put up by, again, Daughters of the Confederacy or whatever organization you have, like Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, who were behind like the Bear River one. And it's like, here's the history of the organization. Here's why they did it. Here's all of this information that might help you make this decision.
Somebody, I'm going to answer this one because it's directly about the murals that we see behind us. And they're asking, what role do the murals have in the public square in Minnesota and elsewhere? And how is that different from the monuments? Actually, they're very similar because this is conflict art. And many of the monuments that have been established are based on a history and a narrative. This is recontextualizing the narrative that exists in the community, which led to the conflict that began with. So that's why it's just as important. And it's a new monument. I think a lot of times what I deal with in public art is that people think all the time when you say, let's do a monument, it's got to be a statue. And we deal with that a lot of times with veterans memorials. They want to see a statue because it's the representation that they want of the image of the fighting man and how they protect the community. But when you have new artists like Maya Lin, who is also an architect, they are reconfiguring what it is to be a public monument. And so the work that they have done in creating environmental art as monuments, where people can come and engage and interact, from listening to multiple stories of communities, not just the veteran from the United States, but the people who are protected and fought alongside American veterans get to have their story retold in such a way that that narrative is told from a fuller perspective. This is just a new version of the monument. And that's why these murals are super important, because it is a new form of communication. And I take it one step further and challenge the United Nations and UNESCO rules that protect journalists as well. This is a new form of journalism as well, a new form of communication. As the world becomes more global and smaller, and people are moving due to environmental change, political change, crime, protecting their children, their families, jobs, they come to the United States with limited skills in language and in culture, multiculturalism. These explain a story that people can relate to in their own perspective from where they came from without having to read a newspaper. Newspapers are dying. The forms of mass communication on what's happening in communication in your community are changing, and it's not always accessible to people of color because they don't have computers and they don't have Wi-Fi. So street art is the new monument. It's the new conflict art, and it needs to be protected along with the people who create the work, because what we're seeing in different countries, from Afghanistan, where muralists who create political art have to leave in droves because they are being killed and imprisoned. When you see artists in Cuba for simple statements against the government being disappeared. We're lucky, but we're starting to see things change in the United States, where it's not always people disappearing or going to jail, but you're also starting to see the language that people who have been marginalized being used against them. Case in point, Black Lives Matter mural was forced to be taken down in Palo Alto, California, because law enforcement said they felt threatened, they felt harassed, and they felt terrorized. So it's very important to have this here and recognize what it is. It is the new monument. And that's why I brought it into this conversation, because I hope that people take the time to reflect on what needs to be done with these monuments as well. Some would say, put them up next to the statues. But does that work? And I ask you, is that another option? Because we have somebody here that, well, I'm going to combine two conversations. One person says, can there be an inclusive process that can create new monuments with multiple viewpoints? Or why don't you just take all of it down, period?
I did offer that as an answer to a question one time when Lisa Blee and I were trying to talk about our book. I said, this could be the death of monuments that we're looking at right now. She vehemently disagreed with me. I mean, I think we're interrogating what is the process of memorialization in ways that can ultimately really be healthy, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the Pollyanna me, which there is a big piece of here.
And what's fascinating about that question is that when we still think about how are we going to memorialize, how are we going to remember, the default is still, let's build a monument.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those, and I have very few answers. I just like to talk. But it's one of those things where it's like the automatic response to finding a way to memorialize and remember something is a monument.
That's absolutely true, because honestly, I just read an article that said they're going to build a statue of Emmett Till in Mississippi and put it next to another statue. Again, we're just fostering the same cycle of what we're accusing others of doing. It does not help to put another statue next to another statue.
But there's all kinds of other ways that people don't really think about much either. And the names of buildings on a college campus,
True.
right? Street signs,
True.
very often are about some historical figure, if it's not the developer trying to, get business drummed up. But memorialization is all around us.
Yeah.
If we stop to pay attention to it. One of the things we did with this project is we went to the location of each of the monuments and we interviewed passersby to see if they knew what was going on there. And most of the time they had not a clue. What was one of the times that was interesting was the first time I ever saw the replica was one of the replicas was in Kansas City. And I knew what that statue was. And I said, what is a monument to Massasoit doing in Kansas City? Which is the genesis of the book project. In talking, and the title of the first article we wrote about this, but we only found one person who knew what that was of all the people we talked to, and they were from Massachusetts. But that's a big, it's 9 feet tall. It's like cannot be missed.
Yeah. We've got two really good questions, and so I want to make sure that we take the time to address them. First question, how effective is the approach of outside groups pressuring decision makers and becoming the decision makers ourselves? I'm sorry, how effective is the approach of outside groups pressuring decision makers versus becoming the decision makers ourselves? State Capitol Board, Historical Society, Montpelier. So.
I mean, I guess my off the cuff answer to that is it's not so easy to become a part of those boards, commissions, committees. Right? That's a process. That's a political process.
That is a political process.
So I don't know, Katie.
I'd love to be able to have this be more of like a back and forth, because my main question is, who are the outside groups?
Right.
And it's always one of those things. And again, like, it's a process to be on a board or a commission. You have to either know somebody, or you have to know that the application is out there, and you have to fit whatever they think they want the picture of the board to be.
Right.
And so the layers of bureaucracy and red tape and just like the labyrinth of all of these, I think is something we can't overlook.
Right. It's a complicated question, because no matter what you do, no matter what kind of selection committee that you put together that is made up of stakeholders, it's never going to be enough of the stakeholders to get a completely accurate view of how to put it together. So you wind up, you have to have the stakeholders that are the architects. You have to have the people that are providing the commission fee. You have to have people in the community, but normally it's people in the community that have high visibility anyway. It's not going to be Joe Schmo off the street. Hey, come in. We want you to take a look at some artwork. It is going to be either an executive director of a nonprofit arts group. It's going to be a retired community corporate C-suite person. It's going to be somebody, if it is a community activist, it's a group that when you take it back to the body that is giving the okay to it, they want to know these people's names. They don't, and I've done this myself where we put together a selection committee for the Metropolitan Airports Commission because they wanted a signature sculpture at the airport. And the first go round, they looked at these names and said, we don't know who these people are. When you come back again and you add a former mayor, a former executive from General Mills, architect that built the US Bank Stadium, then they are receptive. But you have to really think about how many different groups and different communities and that you can get from these big name folks. You know, are we representing the indigenous community, African American community, Asian community? Are we representing the gay community? Are we representing law enforcement? Are we representing, you know, it's a number of things that you have to go through. And so the likelihood of any individual just like wanted to just step off the street, it's not going to happen.
Well, you also can't predict the future and what people are going to care about in the future.
Very true.
Right. So, I mean, we're looking at things that were put up in the past, and those are the things that matter to those people in the past.
Right.
And then it looks different over time.
Right. So every time that change, it keeps changing. It keeps changing. So the message becomes different with each group as to what to emphasize about history, culture, and reformatting the narrative.
So this is where my skepticism for the medium of monuments comes up, because it literally it's a lot of things, right? But a couple of things to mention is in some ways monuments are often put up because people are desperate that something's going to be forgotten. Right. And the other thing it tries to do is fix something in time and place. And history doesn't work that way.
Here's another question, a very good question. Germany preserved sites of mass slaughter of Jews in order to use them as teaching tools to ensure that history was never repeated. Is this relevant to us here? I think we have our own sites that we have identified that really do need correcting and remodeling. Case in point, Fort Snelling. You know, with the site of 38 Dakota men being massacred, slaughtered, we do have sites that can be used as teaching tools. It's just that sometimes, as we just said, as we try to correct it, the message changed and the people involved in producing that message changes too. And yes, there is always bias in a government agency when changing the narrative in order to fit what the community wants. I'll get into that in a minute.
Well, and it's interesting that you use Fort Snelling as an example. And so the 38 were hanged in Mankato, not at Fort Snelling, but if you go to Fort Snelling, and I just went there in August with my older son, there is so much history at a place like Fort Snelling that trying to cram almost, well, by this point, over 200 years of history into like all of these tiny little buildings, into like, if you happen to take one of the guided tours, right, the information you get there, all of this, that's part of it. One of my colleagues just last week called it like a cacophony, right, of all of the stories at Fort Snelling. But with Fort Snelling, the site of the concentration camp where Dakota people were interned after the US Dakota War of 1862 is part of the state park. It is not part of the site of that is Fort Snelling, right? That's the entity of the state and the Historical Society. That's part of the state park. And that is not something you will know unless you know somebody who knows that answer. That's the only reason I learned about it, that it's part of the state park. But so much of this kind of history is a performance. And I'm not just talking about the interpreters that you see at Fort Snelling who are demonstrating like the military, right? Not the military demonstrations, the costumed interpreters and things like that. But monuments are a performance. And like you said, you know, it's fixing this time, trying to fix this moment in time, in a place, as history keeps moving past it. And it's that balance and that battle between what we can save, what we can preserve, versus what is just going to keep going right on by.
Well, and Fort Snelling, or Budote, the sacred place of origin of Dakota people, is the never to be settled argument. I mean, I'm going to get the details wrong, so I apologize. There was a 2-year study of what they were going to do with the signage there that was recently in June. So
Yes.
you would probably know more than I do in the audience.
Yes.
And they decided that it was too controversial. They had to leave it alone. So even Budote came off the sign.
Yeah.
There are so many stakeholders for that place. This battle has been going on for years.
Yeah. Yeah. And this goes back to that question about governmental power impacting the ability to change, because one of the discussions was, what do you do when the broader community does not understand Dakota custom? The question was, what if we want to spread tobacco? There was a complaint that things were going to get dirtied up in the display. Not understanding history, not understanding that this is tradition, was only looked at a maintenance aesthetic. We don't want to have to clean this up. So that does happen when you have different entities in government that are working with communities to change a monument, but don't have the full understanding of what that is. And even in that discussion that we were talking about Fort Snelling, and they were talking about, we don't want, tobacco spread. I had to put together a PowerPoint to say, in the Black community, the blue bottles and the trees ward off evil spirits. In the Catholic community, you light candles to say prayers, and I think in the East Indian community, the evil eye, and the Mediterranean, in the Greek communities too, is to ward off spirits. So what is the difference in people using traditional items and methods to represent the culture? You've got to open your minds up to understand other people in order to make the critical change and not look at it as a maintenance issue. So we have 10 minutes left. Here's a good question. If responding to monuments with more monuments may not be the best strategy, what other modes can we look to from other places, cultures, and times?
I'm just going to talk for a minute about, I don't know if people noticed when the slide was up of the new marker at the Massasoit Monument, but there were a few stones and a piece of red fabric on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice that? I can't tell you exactly why that's there, but I think I know why those were there. And it has to do with Indigenous ways of remembering history in New England. Mm-hmm. Where one of the ways that history is archived in Indigenous communities, and has been for as long as I know about, is when you passed a place where something significant happened, you paused, you placed something, you added something. It's an accretion method, so you get what we call memory piles, mm-hmm. and you pause to explain the history and significance of what happened there. That's a very dynamic way of telling history.
Yeah.
I just bring it up as that's a different mode. In other places, there's memory holes. So you remember this place, this really important thing happened here that's like literally part of the landscape.
Right.
So those are different modes. They're not obelisks or imagined renderings of a white male or anything like that, but they're cool. I don't know what to say. They're really useful.
I think we need to stop looking at the big monument as the way to express recognition, history, recounting a story. All cultures do this in their own way.
Mhm.
The easiest example I can give of a public art memorial that we all know is if you drive down the street and you see a cross and flowers on the side of the
Yeah.
road. That's a monument. That's a public monument. So we all do it in different ways. It's just that we tend to think of things in big laborious ways and how to recognize people. Even the most simplest thing, when a kid puts a picture of their puppy next to a cross on the side of the road, is a public monument. So we really need to start rethinking how we look at public monuments and how we share stories. There's always a certain element of call and response to any public monument. And that is in every culture, African-American culture as well. It's a matter of recognizing and then getting people to retell the narrative again and again, whether it is with a small tribute or whether it's with a bronze statue. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. We got 10 minutes. If you guys got any more questions that you want to throw in there. I really think it's interesting that there is an element of survivance in all of this. Am I correct? It is taking what you have given us and turning it on its head to empower people. Can we talk about the movement that is happening in the Native community that I don't think a lot of people have heard and know what it means in terms of re-empowering people in their own communities? Can that be applied to the monuments movement?
I'm trying to think of, are indigenous folks bound up in monuments? Here's an example of one that's really great. On my home reservation, White Earth in northwestern Minnesota, there's a signage project. And it's actually a bunch of Native folks worked on it as an activist project. And they selected particular sites on the reservation, worked with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, because there are specs, of course, for signs, for highway signs. And they have, they've installed signs with the Ojibwe name of the place first. And if anybody knows anything about Ojibwe, you know, these are really, really long words.
Lots of vowels.
And the English word is underneath.
Yeah.
So the Ojibwe word and then Snyder Lake. That's a memorialization process that also has to do with the importance of language resurgence and revitalization and retention. So that's one example. The Native museum movement, you know about more than I do. Go ahead and talk about it.
Well, I was just going to build off that, and because they've done the same thing on my reservation in Wisconsin, has been to put these signs up to do things like that. But another thing that I can't remember, time has lost all sense of meaning.
Right.
But in the recent past, in like our tribal newsletter that I get every week, they put out a call for nominations, because there are 2 roads on the reservation that basically have the same name. One is like Bishop Lane, and then it's like Bishop Lane North, and people probably are always like, oh man, which Bishop Lane is it again? And so they put out a call for basically nominations for suggestions to rename the roads. And so, and Red Cliff still is very much like a Catholic reservation. And so even the name Bishop's Lane has a lot of really heavy connotations. But in the proposal, they made it very clear that they wanted road names that had Ojibwe connections or connotations. And so even that too, right? Back to your earlier point about how memory and memorialization is everywhere. Like, these are really fantastic examples of how Native folks are doing their own memory work.
Even in your casino.
Yes. And so what Jeannie means by that, this is the downside of being on a panel with your grad advisor, because she knows everything. So one of the things that I'm doing research on is on this enormous Indian pageant that they did on my reservation in the 1920s.
Another form of memorialization.
Another form of memorialization. And my mom and I went like to the casino because we were like, well, we need a bathroom break. And inside they had all of these huge photos of the pageant. And they had all of these photos of the pageant next to kind of this whole wall where they have the names of our veterans.
Hmm.
And one of the pictures that's in there is my grandma's picture
Hmm.
that my uncle submitted. And so you have all of these connections in all of these ways. And the only way anybody's going to know that is if they stop in the Legendary Waters Casino on the Red Cliff
Yeah,
Reservation.
yeah.
But it's still a way to memorialize and remember in our own way.
Mm-hmm.
And so
And Indigenous museums have been around for a long time. The first one I know about is the Mohican Museum in 1930s. Gladys Tantaquidgeon started that, but the museum movement is a really big thing in Indigenous communities.
Mhm.
So that's another way.
I'm going to combine two questions because we got a flurry of questions at
And we
the
got
last.
5
Okay,
minutes.
we got 5 minutes. And so I'm gonna try to shove them in together. Okay. I know, right? Okay. If cultural customs have the ability to negative affect others, should they be curtailed or modified? And who should we be listening to when we think about what to do with monuments that are problematic? Ha. Should I repeat that again?
No, I think that brings us back to our very first question, really.
Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, and I think unless you try to cast a really, really wide net, and then you're going to have people coming back and say, you didn't talk to me or us.
Right. Right.
Right. So
Okay. Last question. Jean, how did Massasoit end up in Kansas City?
thank you.
this is such a good story.
This is what we set off to figure out. And what we figured out is that it was the result of a massive case of fraud in the fine art market that is related to Brigham Young University and its very naive curator of collections. And so it turns out that Cyrus Dallin, the sculptor, was actually born in Springville, Utah. But he was trained in Paris and he went off to Boston. He became this very famous artist there. And when he finished with casting the statue, he donated the cast to the state of Utah. And it somehow went out of their possession and ended up at BYU, and this naive curator in connection with, there's a lot of fraud in the fine art market, we found out. I didn't know.
Yes, there is.
There were at least 5 and as many as 7 illegal casts made, unauthorized casts, I should say. And they circulated in this art world and purchased mostly by real estate developers
Huh.
who want to be art collectors but don't really know much about art.
Uh-huh.
And in this case, the Kansas City one is this Miller Nichols family that were the big developers of Country Club Plaza, the big real estate development in Kansas City, if you know that town. And that place is populated by these outdoor sculptures. So that's how it ended up in Kansas City. It also ended up in a mall in southwest suburbs of Chicago. And we tracked one down. Finally, the last one we found had gone. We think it was originally, we know it was in Spokane. We think that one is now the one that's in the Dayton Art Museum.
Oh, wow.
And they have it on wheels. They carted out so they can have wedding receptions
that's
in
bizarre.
the museum. Anyway, that's the short explanation about what it ended up.
It's always like when you tell that first part of it, it's always like a Mad Lib where it's like, you never know what she's going to say next.
It was a real detective story, and it was actually an awful lot of fun to try to figure this out.
Well, and there's still one at BYU, right?
Yep, there's one at BYU. And there's one at the Utah State Capitol. It used to be inside, now it's outdoors, demoted.
Everybody, we had fantastic questions. Give yourself a pat on the back and please thank our panelists for being here. There is going to be a videotape of this. And so if you want to tell folks who couldn't make it, please share. They can watch this video. They can make copies and share it with everybody. Public art is really important. And as I move through this, I'm become a zealot about how important public art is and trying to make sure that we tell the correct narrative of our community. Minnesota is in a unique position following the murder of George Floyd to really show the world and lead by example of how we can change the narrative for people of color in this community and how we can work together as allies and supporters to make sure that the story of who we are and the legacy of who we are as Minnesotans is a complete story with everybody's history intact. So go out and do your work. I empower all of you. You are all public art advocates from this moment on. Thank you.